17. The Ministry of the Saints. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 10 to 24. And herein I give my advice, for this is expedient for you, who have begun before, not only to do, but also to be forward a year ago. Now therefore perform the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to will, so there may be a performance also out of that which ye have. For if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. For I mean not that other men be eased, and ye burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may be a supply for their want, and that their abundance also may be a supply for your wants, that there may be equality. As it is written, He that had gathered much had nothing over, and he that had gathered little had no lack. But thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care into the heart of Titus for you. For indeed he accepted the exhortation, but, being more forward of his own accord, he went unto you. And we have sent with him the brother, whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord, and declaration of your ready mind. Avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance which is administered by us, providing for honest things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. And we have sent with them our brother, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon the great confidence which I have in you. Whether any do inquire of Titus, he is my partner and fellow helper concerning you, or our brethren be inquired of, they are the messengers of the churches, and the glory of Christ. Wherefore, show ye to them, and before the churches, the proof of your love, and of our boasting on your behalf. Paul continues in this passage with the subject of charitable giving to the churches of Palestine who were in great need. A year ago, the Corinthians had been willing to give readily, verse 10. He hopes that there will now be a readiness to give as they did before, verse 11. Their hostility to Paul should not affect their charitable giving, for Paul was not the recipient thereof, verse 11 following. Paul's concern was not to burden nor to punish the Corinthians, but that Christian charity be maintained. A tithe is required by God as his kingdom tax, but no percentage is stipulated for charity nor for our necessary amount of daily giving, verses 13 to 16. Paul is grateful that Titus's expectation of them is vindicated, as is Paul's, verse 17, and that of another brother, verses 18 and 19. Paul does not cite the name of the other brother, verse 18 following. He thereby does not limit the charitable concern to himself and Titus, but makes it inclusive of the church, verses 17 to 24. The saints are ministering to the saints, and the Corinthians are a part of the fellowship. This is an important text, and Paul is greatly concerned. He sees this giving as a test of the church in Corinth, but he does not say that it is a necessary gift. This fact is very important, and we have something in this text that is neglected by the church today, and has been neglected most of history. There is here the basic question of giving. Now, in our century, which is ending, we have seen a great deal of controversy on the subject. In fact, during the first half of the century, and well into the second half, there was a question of what was called by many storehouse giving, based on Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, where the command was to, quote, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, end quote, which was defined by the Lord as mine house. The storehouse was literally a storehouse or a barn. There are still many surviving from the colonial and early constitutional era throughout the eastern portion of the United States, places like Indiana and Ohio. They were, literally, old stone barns that had been built by Christians. They were controlled by Christians, and they were literally storehouses. After all, in those days, if you were a farmer, you could not readily tithe everything, nor do it easily. How were you going to tithe 10 cows to the church, or 10 sheep, or 10 goats? And what if you had in the village church a dozen or more men who were tithing the same way? It was not a cash economy, basically. What you and other Christians did was to build a storehouse. Into this storehouse, you brought your grain and your livestock. This livestock then were sold in due time, and the amount of tithe that you had therein was credited to you. It was an excellent system, and it was a biblical one. When the Americans followed that practice, they were following an ancient one. Paul refers to this same type of giving, not the form of it, because they were urban peoples that he was writing to in Corinth, but it was the same premise. You were going to give, and that giving was to go for the work in Palestine, where there was great need. So this was charitable giving. This is important for us to recognize as a basic form of biblical giving. We are not aware of this as much today as we were in the first half of the century. We do not realize, especially because the states control so much giving, how much giving there has been by Christians. When World War I ended, the amount of giving by Christians to the needs in the various parts of the world was enormous. One of the things notable to me was the Near East relief. This dealt with immediate help to the victims of massacres, Armenian, Greek, and others. The giving was incredible, thoroughly godly. But you also had remarkable giving by the state. For example, Hoover's relief in Soviet Russia during the famine of the post-war era. It was unlike federal aid today. It still had the flavour of Christian charitable giving. Paul, in this passage, is urging such giving. Believers in Palestine were in desperate need of food because of the famine there. When we face up to a situation like that, we have to face up to a fact that Paul, in these verses, calls attention to. The fact that such giving was not mandatory. It was required that Christians be charitable, but no amount was set. It did not equal a tithe or a half a tithe. It was something in the way of a response from the heart. This necessitates that we immediately understand what Christian giving and requirements to give are, and that they were the same in the New Testament as they were in the Old. This is important, and it is not much taught in the Church. We have, first of all, one general classification of giving called tithes. Tithes literally meant tenths or taxes, and it required that a man give to the Lord's work a tenth of his income. Although this was the basic tax for the church, it was not required that the church collect it forcibly or that the church use the state to collect it. Every time, whether in Catholicism or Protestantism, that the idea of a compulsory, mandatory tax has been imposed, there's been trouble. The trouble has been the decline of Christian faith. It is no longer a matter of faith and character, it becomes a matter of, the federal government is going to take this from you because supposedly God requires them to. But the requirement that God makes is of you, not of the state. So it is a mandatory tax, but it is given by the individual, not collected in any strong-arm way, not collected with a state tax collector or some Christian officer who had the right of the sword and could come at you with a gun and say, "I'm here to collect your tithe." Every time that happened in the church, because of an overzealous desire to be scriptural, the result was disaster, because God said, "The tithe is mandatory of you, but I am not including anyone else in this. It is my law word spoken to you. You keep it. I will punish you if you don't." Caesar and the church have no punishment right. A second kind of giving, in order that we can put into context what Paul is saying here, was what was often spoken of as gifts or offerings. You often read in the Old Testament of tithes and offerings. The tithe was a flat percentage of your income that you gave because God required it. Nobody interfered. It was between you and the Lord. The offering was a gift over and above the tithe, So that if you had a tithe of 2,000 and you gave 500 above and over that, the 2,000 was your tithe, it was your tax. Then whatever amount was above the tithe was your gift to the Lord. So you had two kinds of giving here. But there was a third kind, and this is what Paul in much of 2 Corinthians is dealing with, and this is to supply the needs of the saints. Is there a famine in Palestine? Why, these people are your Christian brothers. They may be Gentiles, they may be Jews, but you provide for them as much as you are able. This has been the biblical pattern over the centuries. Not always well kept, but always very, very important, because it bound the churches together in times when they were so widely separated that they had no way of knowing even the nationalities of the people involved. In the last century, needs in various parts of the world, especially famine, were met by Christians, and met by them readily. One of the things that came into being in the last century was a little wooden box with a slot in it. It was kept on the kitchen table, and that practice continued into this century. Some of you may remember this kind of giving. At every meal, it was passed around, and even the children gave of what little they had. Those wooden banks would have the pennies of the children and the larger silver and paper money of the adults. When they were filled, they were taken to the church or the missionary offices and exchanged for empty ones. This was to me a very familiar form of giving. It was a wonderful form because it made one mindful, even though it was on a voluntary basis entirely. Paul stresses this voluntary aspect, and yet how important it is, and why he has great confidence that they will give, that they will become messengers. Verse 3. And so he says, I have been boasting to other churches on your behalf, because I do believe that, whatever your sins and faults are, you are a people of faith with a generous spirit. We have, thus, three types of Christian giving that we need to familiarize ourselves with: the tithe, the gift or offering, and then ministering to the needs of the saints. Look at these three fully and carefully. In the third volume of Institutes of Biblical Law, I call attention to the fact that in terms of Scripture, God's plan is that the needs of society be met by Christians. These free will offerings of funds for charitable purposes are to govern a vast area which we know as welfare, meeting the needs of the community. The Bible does not envision an order in which the state is taking care of everything, but Christians are. Through the tithe, the church takes care of worship and of education, and much, much more. Through charity, this third form of giving, Christians create a social order in which the state is merely the policing power. You also realize from the nature of this kind of giving the three ways provided for in the Bible, how God's plan is for the government of the world by His saints. When you look to certain areas when Christians did their duty in this respect, how wide and powerful their government was, they took care of health, education, and welfare. The state took care of justice, criminal justice. God's plan from the very beginning has been a marvelous one. We can understand, therefore, why Paul pleads so much with the Corinthians to meet their responsibilities here, and how grateful he is that they are doing so, because they are manifesting their belief that God is the King, the ruler of all creation, and therefore he has a requirement of us, his citizens, to meet the needs of government, his government.